The Bre-X scandal. The fool's gold. $82 billion vanished. Not stolen in the night. Not seized by a government. Not lost in a market crash. It simply never existed, and the man who made it disappear jumped out of a helicopter over the jungles of Borneo. This is the Business Blackbook, where billion-dollar empires are built and collapse. The hook. Imagine holding a rock in your hand. Just a rock. Gray, dusty, unremarkable. The kind of thing you'd kick off a sidewalk without a second thought. Now, imagine that rock is worth $82 billion. Not because of what it is, but because of what someone told you it was. That is the story of Bre-X Minerals, the greatest mining fraud in human history, a company that rose from nothing, built on sand, and collapsed so completely that it erased the retirement savings of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who trusted a lie. But here's what they never tell you in the history books. The lie wasn't just convincing, it was perfect. So perfect that geologists, governments, investment banks, and some of the smartest financial minds on the planet looked directly at the evidence and saw exactly what they were supposed to see. Because the man behind this wasn't a con artist in a back alley. He was a visionary in a boardroom, and the difference is everything. At the author's davity, it is 1993. The world is hungry, not for food, for gold. The great gold rush of the modern era is in full swing. Mining companies are scouring every corner of the planet, drilling into mountains, crossing jungles, bribing officials, doing whatever it takes to find the next great deposit. Because whoever finds gold finds power, and whoever finds the most gold becomes untouchable. Into this world walks a man named David Walsh. Walsh is not your typical mining executive. He is not polished, not Ivy League, not the kind of man who makes rooms go quiet when he enters. He is a stockbroker from Calgary, Canada, with a string of failed ventures behind him, a maxed out credit card in his pocket, and a mortgage he can barely pay. By most measures, David Walsh is a man on the edge of irrelevance, but Walsh has something that the polished men in their glass towers do not. He has John Felderhoff. Felderhoff is a geologist, a legend actually in certain circles, a man who had spent decades crawling through the jungles of Southeast Asia, reading the earth like a language only he could speak. He had a reputation for finding gold where others saw nothing. And in 1993, he had a theory. The theory was Busang, a remote site deep in the rainforests of Indonesian Borneo, Kalimantan, a place so isolated that reaching it required small planes, river boats, and sheer determination. Felderhoff believed, based on his geological reading of the region, that Busang sat on top of something extraordinary, a deposit of gold so massive it would rewrite the record books. Walsh believed him. And in 1993, Bre-X Minerals, Bre-X Minerals, a company so small it barely had an office, staked a claim on that jungle site with money Walsh scraped together from family loans and credit card advances. Nobody paid attention for a while. Then came Michael de Guzman. De Guzman was Felderhoff's chief geologist on the ground, a Filipino mining expert, soft-spoken, meticulous, deeply religious by all accounts. He was the man who would run the actual drilling operations at Busang, the man whose job it was to pull core samples from the earth, analyze them, and report back to the world exactly how much gold was down there. And what he reported changed everything. By 1995, Bre-X was announcing gold estimates out of Busang that made the entire mining world stop breathing. 2 million ounces, then 10 million, then 30 million, then 70 million ounces of gold. The numbers kept climbing. Each announcement sent the stock price soaring higher. Bre-X, which had been trading for pennies, was now trading for hundreds of dollars per share. By 1996, the company was valued at $6 billion. The stock was listed on major exchanges. Pension funds were buying it. Mutual funds were loading up. Individual investors from Canada to Indonesia were pouring their savings in. Financial analysts were writing glowing reports. Mining companies were offering billions to get a piece of Busang. The Indonesian government was paying attention. And at the center of it all, Felderhoff and Walsh were hailed as visionaries, as the men who had found the largest gold deposit in human history, a site that, if the estimates were correct, held more gold than any single mine ever discovered. The press called it the gold discovery of the century. Investors called it a miracle. Wall Street called it a buy. Only one person knew the truth, and he was deep in the jungle, deciding what to do about it. Long cylindrical tubes of rock pulled up from deep underground. These samples are then crushed, tested, and analyzed. The gold content of those samples determines everything: the size of the deposit estimate, the value of the company, the price of the stock, the dreams of every investor who bet their savings on that number. It is, in other words, the foundation of everything. And Michael de Guzman had learned something extraordinary about foundations. They can be rebuilt. The process is almost insultingly simple, which is perhaps why nobody suspected it for so long. You take the core samples. Before they are sent to the lab for analysis, you introduce gold, shaved from jewelry, purchased on the open market, ground into fine dust and mixed directly into the crushed rock. Small amounts, careful amounts, enough to show extraordinary results, but not so much that the numbers seem physically impossible. Do it right, and the lab receives legitimate-looking samples. The results come back showing genuine gold content. The geologists who review those results have no reason to doubt them because the samples are real. The lab work is real. The only thing that isn't real is what was in the ground. De Guzman was doing this at an industrial scale. For years, hundreds of core samples, thousands of data points, an entire geological fiction, constructed grain of gold by grain of gold, in a jungle where nobody was watching closely enough, where the remoteness of the location made independent verification almost impossibly difficult, where the sheer complexity of the data made it easy to bury anomalies in plain sight. There is a particular genius to this, and I want you to understand it clearly. De Guzman didn't just fake one number. He built an entire universe of fake data that was internally consistent. The samples told a story. The ratios made sense. The geological narrative that Felderhoff constructed around it was coherent. It wasn't the work of an amateur forger. It was the work of someone who understood exactly how the system evaluated truth and built his lie to fit that evaluation perfectly. But here's the thing about lies built on gold dust. Eventually, you run out of dust. The cracks? By late 1996, the pressure was becoming unbearable. Because when you claim to have found the largest gold deposit in human history, people want to certify it. Major mining companies, sensing an opportunity, began positioning themselves to acquire a stake in Busang. Freeport-McMoRan, one of the most experienced and respected mining companies on the planet, entered into a joint venture arrangement and sent their own team of geologists to conduct independent due diligence. Independent due diligence. Those two words are where the story begins to fracture. Freeport's team drilled their own holes, pulled their own samples, ran their own tests, and the numbers didn't match. Not by a small margin, by an astronomical margin, where Bre-X's samples showed extraordinary gold content. Freeport's independent samples showed almost nothing, trace amounts, far below what would make the site economically viable, let alone the greatest discovery in history. Freeport quietly flagged the discrepancy, asked for an explanation, requested further testing. Back in the jungle, Michael de Guzman received word that his fraud was unraveling. What happened next depends on who you believe. The official version is that de Guzman, facing exposure, boarded a helicopter over the Kalimantan jungle on the 26th of March 1997 and jumped or fell or was pushed. A body was found 4 days later in the jungle below, badly decomposed, partially consumed by animals, identified as de Guzman through fingerprints, though questions about that identification have never entirely gone away, because Michael de Guzman had 4 wives, multiple identities across different countries, a man who had constructed layers of personal fiction that mirrored almost poetically the professional fraud he had spent years building. Whether he died that day or whether the jungle swallowed someone else while he walked away into a new identity, nobody can say with absolute certainty. What is certain is what happened next. The betrayal moment. On the 4th of May, 1997, Strathcona Mineral Services released its independent audit of the Busang site. The report was not long. It did not need to be. It concluded that the gold samples from Busang had been, in their words, salted in a sophisticated, systematic, and long-term operation. It concluded further that the Busang deposit, the greatest gold discovery in human history, the $6 billion foundation of an empire, contained insignificant amounts of gold. The word insignificant applied to a deposit that investors believed held 70 million ounces. That morning, when the Toronto Stock Exchange opened, Bre-X shares were halted for trading. When the halt was lifted, the stock went into free fall from roughly $15 per share to 4 cents in 1 day. 1 day. $6 billion in market capitalization. Gone. But the $6 billion on paper was only part of it, because in the years leading up to this moment, as the stock climbed, as the story grew bigger and more irresistible, hundreds of thousands of ordinary people had invested. Pension funds in Canada, in Ontario, in Quebec, had purchased Bre-X as a legitimate holding. Teacher pension funds, municipal employee funds, retail investors who had read the glowing analyst reports and bought in with their retirement savings. All of it gone. The total wealth destruction has been estimated at over $82 billion in today's values. And the men who built this empire? Walsh died of a brain aneurysm in the Bahamas in 1998 before he could face trial. Whether he truly knew the full extent of the fraud or was himself a victim of the people around him remains a question that was never answered in a courtroom. Felderhoff was charged with insider trading. He had sold approximately $84 million worth of Bre-X stock in the months before the collapse, while publicly telling investors the company had never been stronger. He was acquitted in 2007. Acquitted. Let that sit with you for a moment. The man who presided over the greatest mining fraud in human history, who built the geological narrative that made the lie believable, who sold $84 million of stock while the fraud was still running, walked free. Because in a court of law, the prosecution could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he knew the samples were salted. That is the architecture of the perfect crime. Not just deceiving investors, but constructing a fraud so insulated from its own center of gravity that even when it collapsed, the men at the top could say, "I didn't know." The collapse. Within weeks, the fallout spread like wildfire through the global mining industry. The Indonesian government, which had been negotiating stakes in Busang worth potentially hundreds of millions, was left holding empty promises. Regulatory bodies across North America launched investigations that consumed years and produced almost no criminal convictions. Class action lawsuits were filed and settled for fractions of the losses. Analyst firms that had given Bre-X glowing recommendations quietly updated their methodologies without acknowledging what their negligence had cost ordinary people. And in Kalimantan, the jungle simply continued to grow. The site at Busang returned to silence. The drilling rigs were removed. The staff dispersed. The infrastructure rotted in the tropical heat. If you flew over it today, you would see nothing but trees. No evidence that this patch of earth had once been the most talked about piece of real estate on the planet. No marker, no monument, just jungle, erasing everything, the way jungles do. Because the jungle doesn't care about your stock certificates. It doesn't care about your audit reports or your analyst ratings or your pension fund contributions. It does not care about your $82 billion. It simply grows back. The final lesson. Here is what the Bre-X scandal actually teaches us. And pay close attention because this is the part they never put in the textbooks. The fraud worked not because people were stupid. It worked because people wanted it to be true. There is a psychological mechanism at work in every great financial fraud, and Bre-X exploited it with surgical precision. When something promises extraordinary returns, when the narrative is compelling enough, when enough respected institutions have already signed on. The human mind does not want to be the one who raises their hand and says, "Wait." Nobody wants to miss the greatest gold discovery in history because they were too cautious. Nobody wants to be the skeptic who sat out the trade of a lifetime. And so the pension fund managers bought the stock, and the investment banks provided the capital, and the analysts wrote the reports, and the governments negotiated the deals. And each institution's participation became evidence that the next institution could point to as validation. A self-reinforcing loop of credibility built on nothing but collective optimism and a man with a bag of gold dust in a jungle in Borneo. The second lesson is about complexity as camouflage. De Guzman understood that most people who would scrutinize his work could not actually go to Borneo and re-drill the holes themselves. They would look at the data, and if the data was internally consistent, if the numbers told a coherent story, if the geological narrative made sense on paper, they would believe it. Complexity doesn't just make things harder to understand. It makes them harder to challenge. And fraudsters have always known this. The third lesson is the most uncomfortable. Nobody went to prison. In one of the largest financial frauds in human history, with losses stretching into the tens of billions, with evidence of systematic deception over multiple years, with a paper trail of insider stock sales conducted by people who almost certainly knew their company was built on lies, nobody went to prison. That is not an accident. That is a feature of the system, a system where complexity provides cover, where jurisdiction creates confusion, where death and acquittal and statute of limitations conspire to ensure that the architects of a fraud that destroyed the retirement savings of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people face no meaningful consequence. And so the next Bre-X is coming. It is always coming because the incentives that created it have never been dismantled. The desire for extraordinary returns, the credentialing power of institutional participation, the difficulty of independent verification in complex technical domain, the human instinct to not be the one who ruins the party. Somewhere right now, someone is holding a core sample and smiling. And with that, the Black Book closes. Subscribe, and we will open the next page soon.